Black general's presence silences prejudiced officers. An apology follows. The tension in the officers' mess was thick enough to cut with a knife. Lieutenant Colonel James Richardson's laughter died in his throat as he caught sight of the tall, imposing figure standing in the doorway. The crude joke about those people hung in the air like a noxious cloud. Conversation ceased. Coffee cups froze midway to lips. 20 pairs of eyes darted between Richardson and the newcomer, whose 3 gleaming stars on each shoulder seemed to catch every bit of light in the room. Major General Solomon Washington's expression remained unreadable as he surveyed the suddenly silent room. His eyes, deep and penetrating, settled on Richardson for just a moment longer than was comfortable before he spoke. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice deep and measured, "I believe we have work to do." 3 weeks earlier, Colonel Frank Harmon stared at the memo on his desk, reading it for the 3rd time as if the words might somehow change. Pentagon brass was sending Major General Solomon Washington to take command of Fort Eagleton, the first black general to ever command the base. Frank ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair, glancing at the photo of his wife and him standing proudly at their son's graduation from West Point. 30 years in the service, and now this. He'd been passed over again. "You wanted to see me, sir?" Captain Michael Reynolds stood at attention in the doorway, his uniform crisp and perfect as always. "At ease, Reynolds, close the door." Frank gestured to the chair across from his desk. "We're getting a new commanding officer next month." Reynolds nodded, his posture relaxing only slightly as he sat. "I heard rumors, sir. General Simmons retiring." "Yes, and they're sending Major General Washington to replace him." Frank watched Reynolds carefully, saw the slight tightening around the younger officer's eyes. Washington, the one who commanded the 3rd Division in the Gulf, the same decorated combat veteran, West Point graduate, Pentagon darling. Frank kept his tone neutral, professional. Reynolds shifted in his chair. "He's got quite the reputation. They say he's a hardliner on discipline." "Among other things," Frank slid the memo across the desk. "He'll be here in 3 weeks. I want the base inspection ready." "Everything by the book?" "Of course, sir." Reynolds scanned the document, his expression carefully controlled. "What about the officer's dinner? It's scheduled for his first week." Frank nodded. "We'll proceed as planned. First impressions matter, Captain." After Reynolds left, Frank stared out the window at the sprawling base he'd called home for the past 5 years. Fort Eagleton was old Army with traditions and unspoken rules dating back generations. Change came slowly here and not always gracefully. Phone buzzed. A text from Lieutenant Colonel James Richardson. "Heard the news. Drinks at the club tonight." Frank typed back, 1900 hours, the usual crowd. Later that evening, the wood-paneled officers' club hummed with subdued conversation. Frank nursed a whiskey, listening as Richardson held court with several of the senior staff officers. "Look, I'm not saying anything against the man's service record," Richardson was saying, his voice just low enough to maintain plausible deniability. "But we all know how these appointments work nowadays. Checking boxes, making sure the press gets their diversity photo ops." Captain Reynolds, sitting across from Frank, glanced around nervously. "Jim, maybe we should—" "Oh, come on, Mike," Richardson interrupted. "We're all friends here. Frank's been running this base like a Swiss watch for years, and they pass him over for what? Politics, pure and simple." Major Lisa Chen, one of the few women in their circle and the base's JAG officer, set down her glass with a sharp click. "With all due respect, Jim, General Washington has an impeccable record. Bronze Star with Valor, Distinguished Service Cross. He's hardly a political appointment." Richardson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure he's earned every ribbon, Lisa. I'm just saying the timing is convenient." Frank cleared his throat. "That's enough, Jim. General Washington will be our commanding officer in 3 weeks. Whatever opinions we might have stay in this room. Once he arrives, he gets the same respect any general deserves." The conversation shifted to safer topics, but Frank noticed the sideways glances, the unspoken agreements among some of his officers. A knot formed in his stomach. This transition wasn't going to be smooth. The following days passed in a flurry of preparations. Frank pushed his staff hard, determined that General Washington would find Fort Eagleton running at peak efficiency. But beneath the surface, whispers continued. Small groups of officers huddled in corners, conversations ending abruptly when others approached. Frank tried to ignore it to focus on the task at hand. But one afternoon, passing the shooting range, he overheard Richardson speaking to a group of junior officers. "Just between us, boys, I knew his type at the academy. Always playing the victim card when they can't keep up." Frank stepped around the corner. "Lieutenant Colonel Richardson." The group snapped to attention. Richardson's face flushed briefly before he regained his composure. "Colonel Harmon, sir, just discussing the new range protocols with the lieutenants." My office, now. Frank kept his voice level, but his eyes conveyed the message. In his office, Frank closed the door firmly. Jim, we've known each other a long time. Yes, sir, since Desert Storm. Then I'll be direct. The talk stops now. I don't care what you think of General Washington or how he got this command. When he arrives, this base will present a united professional front. Richardson's jaw tightened. With all respect, sir, I'm not saying anything that everyone isn't thinking, including you. Frank leaned forward. What I think doesn't matter. What matters is this base and the men and women serving here. General Washington deserves our respect until proven otherwise. Am I clear, Lieutenant Colonel? Crystal clear, sir. Richardson's voice was stiff. Dismissed. As Richardson left, Frank sank into his chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 57 years. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he rarely used. Mark, it's Frank Harmon. I need some insight on Solomon Washington. Major General Mark Donnelly, an old friend from Frank's early days in the service, chuckled on the other end. Frank Harmon. Still hiding out at that museum you call a base. Something like that. They're sending Washington to take over. A pause. Solomon Washington, consider yourself lucky, Frank. This wasn't the response Frank expected. Lucky? Washington is the real deal, tough but fair, brilliant tactician, doesn't play politics. That's not the impression I've been getting from the Pentagon rumor mill. Mark's laugh was short and sharp. Let me guess, you're hearing he's an affirmative action poster boy. That he's there to shake things up, implement some diversity agenda. Frank's silence was answer enough. Listen to me, Frank. I served with Saul in Afghanistan. The man saved my life and the lives of 30 other soldiers when our convoy was ambushed. He went back into the fire 3 times. 3 times, Frank, and never once mentioned it in his report. Mark paused. He's forgotten more about leadership than most generals will ever learn. After hanging up, Frank sat in silence, turning the conversation over in his mind. Had he allowed his own disappointment to color his perception? Had he been tacitly encouraging the grumbling by not shutting it down more forcefully? The days ticked by. Frank tried to steer conversations away from speculation about General Washington, but the undercurrent remained. Reynolds, at least, seemed to be taking Frank's directive to heart, focusing the staff on preparation rather than gossip. Night before General Washington's arrival, Frank found himself alone in his office, reviewing the welcome briefing one last time. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Enter. Major Chen stepped in, a folder in her hands. Final legal review of the transfer documents, sir. Thank you, Major. Frank took the folder, noting her hesitation. Something else, Chen straightened. Permission to speak freely, sir. Always, Lisa. I'm concerned about the reception General Washington will receive. Not from the enlisted ranks or junior officers, but from the old guard, Frank finished for her. Richardson and his cronies. Yes, sir, there's been talk in the officers' mess, not just about General Washington's race, but also rumors that he's coming to implement major changes. That Fort Eagleton has been singled out for being behind the times. Frank frowned. What kind of changes? Everything from new diversity quotas for command positions to eliminating certain traditions. Chen met his eyes directly. Sir, I don't believe these rumors have any basis in fact, but they're creating a hostile environment before the general even arrives. Frank nodded slowly. Thank you for bringing this to my attention, Major. I'll handle it. After Chen left, Frank picked up his phone again, this time calling Captain Reynolds. Mike, I need you to gather the senior staff in the conference room at 700 tomorrow, before the general's arrival. Mandatory attendance. The next morning, Frank faced his senior officers, all bleary-eyed from the early hour. Richardson sat near the back, arms crossed defensively. Gentlemen, ladies, in 4 hours, Major General Solomon Washington will assume command of Fort Eagleton. Before that happens, I want to be absolutely clear about my expectations. Frank surveyed the room slowly. Any officer under my command who shows anything less than full respect and cooperation with General Washington will answer directly to me. Any rumor-mongering, any insinuations about his qualifications or reasons for appointment, any resistance to his orders will be dealt with swiftly and severely. The room was silent, tension thick in the air. Fort Eagleton has a proud tradition of excellence. That includes excellence in leadership, in respect for the chain of command, and in personal conduct. I expect each of you to exemplify these values today and every day forward. Frank paused. Are there any questions? No one spoke. Dismissed, Colonel Richardson, a moment. As the room cleared, Richardson approached, his expression guarded. Jim, I'm speaking to you not just as your commanding officer, but as someone who's known you for 20 years. You're on thin ice. One more comment, one more insinuation, and I'll have you transferred so fast your head will spin. Richardson's face flushed. Sir, no excuses, no explanations, just do better. Frank softened his tone slightly. You're a good officer, Jim. Don't throw away your career over this. At precisely 1100 hours, a black SUV pulled through the main gate of Fort Eagleton. Frank stood at the base headquarters entrance, his senior staff arranged behind him in perfect formation. The car stopped, and the driver rushed to open the rear door. Major General Solomon Washington emerged, tall and commanding in his dress uniform. At 52, his close-cropped hair was salted with gray, but his posture and movements showed no sign of age. His eyes, keen and observant, took in the assembled officers before settling on Frank. Frank saluted sharply. "Major General Washington, sir. Colonel Frank Harmon, welcome to Fort Eagleton." Washington returned the salute. "Thank you, Colonel, at ease." Frank introduced each member of his senior staff. When he reached Richardson, he noticed the lieutenant colonel's salute was textbook perfect, his expression professionally neutral. But something in Richardson's eyes, a coldness, a distance suggested his earlier warnings had only driven the resentment deeper underground. The next few days were a whirlwind of briefings, tour, and introductions as General Washington familiarized himself with the base operations. Frank was surprised by the general's approach. He asked more questions than he made pronouncements, listened more than he spoke, and showed genuine interest in the base's history and traditions. "You've run a tight ship here, Colonel," Washington commented as they walked the perimeter after a long day of inspections. "The maintenance records are exemplary. Morale among the enlisted ranks seems high." "Thank you, sir. We take pride in our work," Washington nodded. I've also noticed something else." He stopped walking, turning to face Frank directly. "There's resistance to my appointment, not from everyone, but from enough senior officers to be concerning." Frank hesitated, caught between honesty and loyalty to his staff. Washington's smile was small but genuine. "You don't need to confirm or deny, Colonel. I've been the first black officer many times in my career, the first black company commander in my battalion, the first black operations officer in my brigade. I know what it looks like, what it feels like. Sir, I assure you any such sentiment does not reflect the values of this base or its leadership." "I believe you, Colonel. And I'm not here to make an issue of it. I'm here to command this base to the best of my ability." Washington resumed walking. "The officers' dinner tomorrow night. It's tradition for the incoming commander to say a few words." "Yes, sir. Nothing formal, usually just a brief introduction." "Good. I'm looking forward to it." Washington glanced sideways at Frank. "And Colonel, I don't believe in hidden agendas. If I plan to make changes at Fort Eagleton, you'll be the first to know, and you'll understand exactly why." Frank nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. "I appreciate that, sir." The officers' dinner was held in the grand ballroom of the Fort Eagleton Club, a tradition dating back to the post-World War II era. White tablecloths, gleaming silverware, and the soft glow of chandeliers created an atmosphere of formal elegance. Frank watched carefully as General Washington moved through the room, engaging easily with officers and their spouses. The general had a gift for conversation, asking thoughtful questions and listening intently to the answers. Even some of the more skeptical officers seemed to warm to him as the evening progressed. Richardson, however, remained stiff and formal, speaking to Washington only when directly addressed. He spent most of the cocktail hour with a small group of like-minded officers, their conversation too quiet to overhear, but their glances toward the general speaking volumes. During dinner, Frank found himself seated between Major Chen and Captain Reynolds. "The general's making quite an impression," Chen murmured, nodding toward where Washington was deep in conversation with the base chaplain. "Did you know he spent 3 years working with humanitarian operations in West Africa?" He was just telling Colonel Martinez about a school his unit helped rebuild. Reynolds nodded. "I overheard him discussing the new artillery training protocols with Major Williams. He knows his stuff, that's for sure." Frank felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps this transition would go more smoothly than he'd feared. Then he caught sight of Richardson's table, where the conversation seemed to grow more animated as the wine flowed freely. After dinner, as coffee and dessert were served, Frank stood to introduce General Washington. The room fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce our new commanding officer, Major General Solomon Washington. General Washington comes to us with a distinguished record of service, including commands in Iraq, Afghanistan, and humanitarian missions across the globe. He brings with him a wealth of experience and a fresh perspective that I know will benefit Fort Eagleton." Frank raised his glass. "To General Washington." The room echoed the toast, and Washington rose to speak. His deep voice carried effortlessly through the ballroom. "Thank you, Colonel Harmon, for that kind introduction, and thank you all for such a warm welcome. I'm honored to join the long line of commanders who have led Fort Eagleton, and I'm humbled by the responsibility entrusted to me. Washington spoke briefly about his career, his family, and his vision for the base, emphasizing continuity and excellence rather than change. He concluded by raising his glass in return. To Fort Eagleton, its proud past and its promising future. As the formal program ended, officers and their guests broke into smaller groups. Frank noticed General Washington making his way toward Richardson's table, where the conversation had grown louder as the evening progressed. Frank moved in that direction, a sense of unease growing in his stomach. "Lieutenant Colonel Richardson," Washington said, extending his hand. "I understand you're the battalion commander for the 2nd Training Battalion. I'd like to observe your field exercises next week if that can be arranged." Richardson stood, shaking the general's hand with visible reluctance. "Of course, sir, though I should warn you we don't use any of those new sensitivity protocols they're pushing at the Pentagon. My men train hard the old-school way." A subtle tension fell over the nearby tables. Washington's expression remained pleasant, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm always interested in effective training methods, Lieutenant Colonel. Perhaps you could elaborate on what you mean by old school?" Richardson, emboldened by alcohol and the supportive nods of his companions, pressed on. "Just that we focus on creating soldiers, sir, not on checking diversity boxes or making sure no one's feelings get hurt." Frank stepped forward. "Jim," Washington held up a hand, stopping Frank's intervention. "It's quite all right, Colonel Harmon." His voice remained calm, conversational. "Lieutenant Colonel Richardson is entitled to his opinion, and I'm interested in hearing more about these diversity boxes he believes are being checked." Richardson shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of the attention from surrounding tables. "Sir, I simply meant that traditional military values shouldn't be sacrificed for political correctness." "I see," Washington nodded thoughtfully. "And which traditional values would those be exactly? Honor, courage, commitment, respect, because I've found those values to be entirely compatible with treating all soldiers with dignity regardless of their background." Richardson's face flushed. "Sir, I meant no disrespect, didn't you, though?" Washington's voice remained level but carried an edge of steel. "Let me be clear, Lieutenant Colonel. I don't know what rumors or assumptions have been circulating about my appointment, but I was selected for this command based on 30 years of service and a record that speaks for itself. The same standards by which you and every officer in this room have been judged." The ballroom had fallen completely silent, all eyes on the confrontation. "I don't care what you think of me personally, but I do care about the example you set for the men and women under your command. If you can't separate your personal prejudices from your professional responsibilities, you have no place in today's Army or at Fort Eagleton." Richardson stood rigid, his face now ashen. "Sir, I apologize if my comments were inappropriate." "Not if, Lieutenant Colonel, they were." Washington held Richardson's gaze for a long moment. "We'll discuss this further in my office tomorrow, 800 hours. "Yes, sir." Washington turned to the rest of the table. "Ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy the remainder of your evening." With a nod to Frank, he moved to the next group of officers, seamlessly engaging them in conversation as if nothing had happened. Frank remained, fixing Richardson with a hard stare. "My office, now." In the privacy of his office, Frank's anger boiled over. "What the hell were you thinking, Jim, after everything we discussed?" Richardson stood at attention, his earlier bravado gone. "Sir, I had too much to drink. It was a lapse in judgment." "A lapse that could end your career. Do you understand that?" Frank shook his head in disgust. "I warned you explicitly." "Yes, sir, you did." Richardson's voice was hollow. Frank sighed heavily. "Go home, Jim, sober up, and be in General Washington's office at 800 tomorrow ready to offer a genuine apology and accept whatever consequences he deems appropriate." After Richardson left, Frank debated whether to seek out General Washington immediately or wait until morning. His decision was made for him when there was a knock at his door. "Enter." Washington stepped in, closing the door behind him. "Colonel Harmon, I thought I might find you here." "General, sir, I want to apologize for Lieutenant Colonel Richardson's behavior. It was completely unacceptable." Washington waved away the apology. "You're not responsible for his actions, Colonel." He settled into the chair across from Frank's desk. "But I am curious about something. How long has this attitude been festering among your senior officers?" Frank met Washington's gaze directly. "Not all of them, sir, but among a few, since the announcement of your appointment." "I see. And why didn't you address it more forcefully?" The question hit Frank like a physical blow. He considered deflecting, making excuses, but something in Washington's steady gaze demanded honesty. "Because part of me shared their resentment," Frank admitted quietly. Not about your race, sir, but I've been running this base for 5 years. I expected the promotion to Brigadier General when they announced you were coming instead. He shook his head. It was unprofessional of me to let my disappointment influence how I handled the situation. Washington nodded slowly. Thank you for your honesty, Colonel. Disappointment is natural. We all face it in our careers. He leaned forward. But let me be clear about something. I didn't ask for this command to block your promotion. I was offered 3 different posts and chose Fort Eagleton because of its reputation for excellence you helped build. Frank blinked in surprise. 3 posts, sir. Yes, including a cushy Pentagon assignment that would have been much easier on my family. Washington smiled slightly. I chose Fort Eagleton because I wanted to command soldiers, not push papers. And because I believed I could make a difference here. I appreciate you telling me this, sir. One more thing, Colonel. I reviewed your service record before accepting this post. You should know that I've recommended you for promotion to Brigadier General in the next cycle. Your work here deserves recognition. Frank was speechless for a moment. Thank you, sir. That's unexpected. It shouldn't be. It's what you've earned. Washington stood. As for Lieutenant Colonel Richardson, I'll deal with him tomorrow. I don't intend to end his career over one drunken indiscretion, but he will understand that such behavior has consequences. The next morning, Frank deliberately arrived at headquarters early, wanting to be present when Richardson met with General Washington. He found the general already in his office, reviewing files. Good morning, sir. Washington looked up. Colonel Harmon, early start today? Yes, sir. I wanted to be available for your meeting with Lieutenant Colonel Richardson. Washington nodded. I appreciate that, but I think it's best if I speak with him privately first. We can meet afterward to discuss next steps. At precisely 800, Richardson arrived, his uniform impeccable, his face set in grim determination. He saluted Frank briefly before being shown into the general's office. The door closed behind him. Frank tried to focus on paperwork but found himself glancing at the clock repeatedly. 10 minutes passed, then 20. At the 30-minute mark, he was considering checking in when the door finally opened. Richardson emerged, his expression unreadable. He nodded to Frank and walked briskly down the hallway. A moment later, Washington appeared in the doorway. Colonel Harmon, would you join me, please? Inside the office, Washington gestured for Frank to sit. Lieutenant Colonel Richardson and I had a productive conversation. He offered a sincere apology, which I accepted. I'm glad to hear that, sir. He also volunteered to lead our new community outreach initiative, working with schools in predominantly minority neighborhoods to develop STEM programs and recruitment pathways. Frank couldn't hide his surprise. Jim volunteered for that? Yes, seemed quite eager, in fact. Washington's smile suggested there was more to the story. I also informed him that he'll be mentoring Major Terrence Jackson, who's transferring in next month. Major Jackson will eventually be taking over the 2nd Training Battalion. Frank nodded slowly, understanding the message. Richardson wasn't being fired, but his days at Fort Eagleton were numbered unless he demonstrated genuine change. Do you think he can adjust his attitude, sir? Truly. Washington leaned back in his chair. I don't know, Colonel. People can surprise you. But I do know this. Giving him a chance to prove himself, to confront his biases directly through meaningful work with the communities he's prejudiced against, that's more valuable than simply punishing him. The weeks that followed saw subtle but significant changes at Fort Eagleton. General Washington's leadership style firm but fair, demanding excellence while showing genuine concern for his officers and enlisted personnel alike, gradually won over even the most skeptical members of the command staff. Richardson, to everyone's surprise, threw himself into the community outreach program with unexpected enthusiasm. Frank observed one session where Richardson was teaching basic engineering concepts to a group of high school students, his natural charisma and teaching ability shining through in a way Frank had never witnessed before. I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, Major Chen commented as she and Frank watched from the doorway. People can change, I suppose, Frank replied, still not entirely convinced. Or maybe they just need the right motivation to reveal who they truly are. Chen smiled. General Washington has a gift for seeing potential in people. 3 months after General Washington's arrival, Frank found himself in the officers' mess for lunch. The room was crowded, conversations flowing freely. He noticed Richardson at a table with several other officers, including Major Williams, one of the few black officers in the senior command. Frank was too far away to hear their conversation, but the easy camaraderie was evident. As he watched, Richardson said something that made the entire table erupt in laughter. It wasn't forced or performative, just genuine human connection. Later that afternoon, Frank passed by the general's office and found the door open. Washington was standing at the window looking out over the parade ground where troops were drilling. "Sir, do you have a moment?" Washington turned. "Of course, Colonel, come in." Frank closed the door behind him. "I wanted to thank you, sir." "For what specifically?" "For how you've handled everything since your arrival. The situation with Richardson, the transition of command, all of it. You've made changes without creating unnecessary disruption. You've challenged people to be better without humiliating them." Frank hesitated. "I've learned a great deal these past few months." Washington smiled. "We all have our moments of growth, Colonel, even at our age." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Since you're here, I'd like your input on something. I'm considering implementing that joint training program with the Air Force that you proposed last year." As they discussed the details of the program, Frank realized how far things had come. The tension and resentment that had greeted Washington's arrival had transformed into genuine respect. Not because Washington had demanded it, but because he had earned it through competence, character, and compassion. The scene from the beginning of our story finally arrives. Lieutenant Colonel Richardson is sharing a joke with fellow officers in the mess when General Washington appears unexpectedly in the doorway. The tension is palpable as everyone realizes Richardson's joke had racial undertones, and he's been caught mid-sentence by the very person it might offend. The silence stretches for what seems like an eternity before Washington speaks his simple line. "Gentlemen, I believe we have work to do." The officers file out, leaving Richardson alone with the general. What follows is not the dressing down many might expect, but a more profound conversation about growth, imperfection, and the ongoing nature of change. "I thought I'd moved past this," Richardson admits, his voice heavy with shame. "I've been working with those kids in the outreach program, getting to know Major Jackson. I really thought I was different now." Washington regards him thoughtfully. "Change isn't a destination, Jim, it's a journey. We all have deeply ingrained patterns of thought that can resurface when we least expect them. The question is what we do when they appear." Later that day, Richardson calls a meeting of all the officers who were present in the mess. Without being ordered to do so, he offers a public apology not just to General Washington, but to every officer of color under his command. "I've prided myself on being a good officer," he tells them, his voice steady despite his evident discomfort. But being a good officer means more than tactical competence or leadership skills. It means recognizing the humanity in every person who wears this uniform, regardless of their background. "I failed in that today, and I've failed in that throughout much of my career. For that, I am deeply sorry." The apology marks a turning point not just for Richardson, but for Fort Eagleton as a whole. In the months that follow, the base becomes a model for inclusivity and excellence in the Army, with retention rates and performance metrics climbing steadily. 1 year after Washington's arrival, Frank, now Brigadier General Harmon, thanks to Washington's recommendation, prepares to transfer to his new assignment at the Pentagon. His replacement, a highly qualified colonel from another base, happens to be a woman of color. As Frank packs up his office, Washington stops by to wish him well. "Quite a year, wouldn't you say?" Washington remarks, looking around at the half-empty bookshelves. "The most educational of my career," Frank agrees, "though not in the ways I expected." Washington nods thoughtfully. "The best lessons rarely come in the forms we anticipate." He hands Frank a small, wrapped package. "A going-away present. Don't open it until you reach Washington." On his first day at the Pentagon, Frank finally unwraps the gift. Inside is a simple frame containing a quote attributed to Maya Angelou. "Do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, do better." Below the quote is a handwritten note from General Washington. "Thank you for doing better. The Army is stronger for it. Fort Eagleton is stronger for it. And so are you." Frank places the frame on his new desk, where it will serve as a daily reminder that leadership isn't just about command and control. It's about growth, humility, and the courage to change. And in the officers' mess at Fort Eagleton, a new generation of leaders gathers, shaped by the example set by those who came before them, not perfect people, but people striving to be better today than they were yesterday. The prejudice that once simmered beneath the surface hasn't disappeared entirely. Such deep-rooted problems rarely vanish overnight. But it has been acknowledged, confronted, and steadily diminished through consistent leadership and genuine human connection. As for Lieutenant Colonel Richardson, he eventually transfers to become the ROTC commander at Howard University, a historically black college, a position he requests specifically. There, he becomes known for mentoring young cadets of all backgrounds, often sharing his own story as a cautionary tale and a testament to the possibility of change. The legacy of that tense moment in the officer's mess and the quiet dignity with which General Washington handled it ripples outward, touching lives far beyond Fort Eagleton. Not through grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but through the patient, persistent work of building a culture where respect isn't just a regulation, but a deeply held value. And it all began with silence, the shocked silence of prejudice exposed, followed by the harder, braver silence of self-reflection, and finally, the healing silence of genuine understanding that needs no words at all. If you've enjoyed this powerful story of transformation and redemption, please subscribe to our channel for more content that explores the complexities of human experience and the journey toward understanding. Your support allows us to continue creating meaningful narratives that challenge, inspire, and connect us all.